Good day, and welcome to another Asian Agribiz podcast. I'm Asian Pork Magazine editor Isa Q. Tan. Today, our regional correspondent Zara Imtiaz is talking to J Y Chow of Mizuho Bank to find out what challenges lay ahead when it comes to meeting the protein gap in animal feed. This is important as raw material prices have had a roller coaster ride this year, and one of the biggest challenges has been in the sourcing of feed protein. Traditional sources, such as soybean, shot up in price across the world, causing feed costs to go up across Asia. As the demand for meat increases in Asia, the cost and sourcing of feed protein is going to be a key concern.
Hi, JY. Thank you for joining us today in our podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much.
So today we are discussing one of the biggest challenges in the livestock industry in Asia, which is getting feed protein. You call this a protein gap. Could you explain what the dilemma really is?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, the protein gap for me is really about the deficit that we have in Asia around protein. And when I mean protein is all the protein needs related to the livestock industry. Either you import the meat or you produce the feed. So if you want to make a sort of conversions, if you aggregate all the meal proteins, either the soybean meal that you crush or the DDGS or every time of raw materials, and including the meat imported, in total, the amount in equivalent of soybean meal for Asia, it's about 130 million tons per year. So this is a huge amount. And I think the most important thing beyond these numbers is really to understand the fundamentals. Will that gap expand or it will narrow? That's probably the most important questions.
Yes, so when we talk about this gap, can you explain more about what are the drivers that are narrowing or expanding this gap?
Sure. So if you want to see the gap, the key question, as I say, it's about if we see the expansions or the reverse narrowing factors. So if you look at one by one, expansions is really about the fundamentals demand for meat and how it converts in terms of livestock productions, about how the upscale farms and what we call the transformations, that means the increasing number of commercial farms in Asia, leading for more commercial feeds and then leading for more imports of feed grain ingredients. On the opposite side, what's the narrowing factors? It's a reverse what we see on meat demand. I think in some countries in Asia, we're going to reach a plateau. This is mainly a demographic issue, right? The growth demography in Asia will narrow down and will start shrinking, like we see in Japan, but also China. We start having a flat movement of the growth of demographic in China. So there is an impact on the stomach share, right? Because the demographic is related to the diet, and you will have an impact on that. And the second factor is about efficiency, right? Year after years, the livestock and feed industry is improving, meaning the feed conversion rate, the FCR, is improving. So meaning that for the same amount of meat to be produced, you will need less feed. So that's an important factor. Another factors will narrow probably that gap is on the supply side. The reason why we have a supply is because the demand issues is because the supply is not catching up in Asia in terms of productions of grains and oilseed. But things may change because China is approving GMO, which can be a game changer in terms of yield improvements. And the last one is really the new trends about the alternative proteins, either from meat or feed.
Just to clarify here, you mentioned alternative proteins as one of the narrowing factors. But isn't it mostly soy-based? So in that case, wouldn't you need more oil seeds?
Well, yes, some of these alternative proteins is soy-based, but they are not all using soy or using plants. You would have some solutions which will use less type of grains which is imported. right? We're talking about chickpeas and other type of mung beans, for instance, that maybe can be produced in Asia, and that could be a game changers. And I think the most important is to look at the feed commercial rate, right? When you produce a meat, let's say a meat patty or meat burgers, when you use from a traditional conventional industry, using livestock and you need feeds, of course, the overall usage of grain and oilseed is important. But when you take that shortcut that the beans or the type of plant base is used directly to build that plant patty, then your conversion is much better, and then you would need less productions of grain and oilseed and definitely less land.
Yes, that makes sense. So how do you see the gap evolve in the mid and long term?
That's a really good questions. Well, I think there's two ways to look at it. Well, in the mid terms, I think the gap will continue to expand. As I mentioned, the drivers is really what we call the proteinizations of a diet in Asia. We still have more and more middle class growing and more affluent, which are hungry about eating proteins. So that would lead to a growth. And of course, the commercializations of feed and the improvement of upscaling farms across Asia will lead also for that growing demands. But on the reverse side, in the long terms, I think that gap will narrow. As I mentioned, there's new disruptions from the alternative proteins will add to that. And also the efficiency gain that we see from across the industry, as I mentioned, the FCR and the GMO, which could be probably game changers. And also one thing which is an underline is really about the demographic. We will have a slowdown growth of demographic and also the aging process, meaning that when you age, the way how you consume will be very different. You will probably reduce your consumptions of red meats and go for more the sort of a healthier choice of proteins, probably more around the seafood or fish, which have a better conversion rate. So all in all, I believe that the protein gap will narrow. And I think the key question is when. And it's very important when you are feed millers or you're building a crushing plant and you want to think about the day after tomorrow. When this inflection point will happen? And this is probably the most important question.
But you also have in Asia a large young population, they say the millennials. And don't you think this would kind of slow down the overall aging demographic for us at least?
Well, yes, we see the growing population of millennials, but the biggest pool of population, if you look at Asia, is definitely China. And China is aging really rapidly. And it's not only China. You see countries like Thailand and Korea, which taking a faster path of aging compared to China. So if you look at some numbers, by the end of this century, we will have countries like China, Korea, Singapore, and even other countries like Japan, where the populations in terms of ratio would have probably over 40% of people over 65%. And those will not consume meat that they did when they are in their 20s.
So I was thinking more of like a South Asian population. Like, do you think that would tilt the balance or not?
It's true, Lara. It can take a balance, but the pool of population for emerging, I would say emerging countries around Asia and Southeast Asia, they are growing, and you have different millennials who will hungry for meat, but it will probably not counterbalance the rapid aging part of Asia. So as you pointed out, maybe you have two sort of trends, one in the sort of Northeast Asia and more developed Asian countries where you will see a slowdown in terms of growth in terms of meat consumptions, where the rest of emerging countries, yes, you will have a rapid growth.
So for one of the follow-up questions I have is about you talking about keys to assess where the inflection point is, right? So how can we, like with so many variables at hand for feed millers, what kind of information do they have to decide on this? How can they come to that decision?
That's a really difficult question, Zara. But what I try to give in the discussion is probably it's very difficult to say exactly by when we will have this possible inflection point. But you need to build sort of a models on your projections to take into account all these new disruptions. It's not as simple as before when you look at just supply and demand, you look at the population growth and what it means in terms of meat demands and converting livestock. And then you know the sort of gap in proteins. Now you have a lot of new disruptions, as I mentioned. So you have the alternative proteins, you have the gain of yield from the crop that you may use GMO in some countries, and also all the change in the way how we do farming will continue to gain efficiencies. So definitely the equations is more complex, but I'm not saying that it's going to be a crystal ball. I believe that, yes, probably the first 5 years, what we see in the midterm, as I mentioned, yes, the growth is still there, but you will see a point where we will sort of decelerations of growth and probably a sort of inflection point where that gap will start narrowing. And I think when it starts narrowing, it will continue to narrow in a sort of a steeper way than expected. That's possible.
Makes sense. And also, of course, you have to take into account random events like a pandemic to disrupt the whole thing.
Correct. Yes. But Zara, maybe I can mention that it's interesting to see that most of the time when you look at that gap, right, the gap was mainly driven by supply shocks in Asia, right? Having most of the country in Asia having sort of a shortfall in terms of production of supply of grain and oilseeds in their own countries or in the regions, where lead to a bigger gap, right? And the pandemic, yes, is probably one of the first time where you see some sort of change in demand, where it's more a demand shock. And another factor, of course, of a demand shock is related to a disease. The African swine fever in China, in Vietnam, and the rest of Asia was definitely a key disruptor.
So back on these factors, what kind of novel ingredients can meet this gap, and where do you see the most promise from?
Yeah, I think the most promising in terms of innovations, probably we haven't seen that, because the way how things evolve is amazing. But I would say there's three main categories of the key disruptions of novel ingredients. On the food is around the alternative proteins in terms of the plant-based, the cell-based, and now more recently precision fermentations, which I think are very promising as well. On the feed side is all the alternative source of proteins that you can have. Is mainly led by insect proteins, but you have the algae, either macroalgae or microalgae, or sort of duckweed and things like that. And the third one, I think, is a bit related to the first two, is really about the circularity that you have in the food chains. So all the circular solutions, how you can upscale food waste and put it back in the systems. And I give an example. When you look at the seafood processing, let's take a shrimp, about 40% of the weight of a shrimp is about the shell and the head, which is not consumed. So if you assume that the growing trends of seafood processing continue, that waste is actually an opportunity to see a way to upscale and convert it back in good proteins, for instance.
You do add that so it is not just one or the other of all these things that you've mentioned, but more like a combination of things that a feed miller would have to consider when replacing traditional protein sources?
Yes, definitely, Zara. I think the way how we always have been asked in terms of questions, who will be the winner in terms of these novel ingredients? I don't think there's only one winner. It will be a combinations of that. And the simple reason is the optionality is very important when you want to do formulations. So it will be how to make complementarity of using the different type of ingredients that you have in hand. And you will take into account the efficiency for you in terms of formulations, but also the impact in terms of sustainability as well.
But as a feed miller, on the ground, do you think this is just going to add more to its complexity of formulation, or simplifying it? Like, how would you reassure them going into the future?
Well, I think it's a good thing to have more options. Yes, it's a bit more complex because you have different new ingredients to incorporate in your formulations. But the way I see formulations, and I went through that at the beginning of my career, it's very dynamic. And the more dynamic you are in your formulations, probably is where the more optimization you can do in your formulations. And in the past, when I started somehow in Asia, there was a sort of a very fixed approach where you would add that amount of corn and that amount of soybeans, and you have very little room to change that. But I think the way how we do formulations, it's gonna be more innovative, meaning that you have better way to measure the efficiencies of each raw materials, and you will better understand how to make formulation by combining those ingredients. And I think one growing theme across those novel ingredients is about the functionality of these ingredients. It's not about only the crude proteins, it's about what the added value of those ingredients in terms of immunities, in terms of improvement of stress, or even some improvement of growing appetite for the animal consuming it. So all in all, you probably have some efficiency gains, especially if you are integrators, for instance.
It's interesting you spoke about your experiences in Asia. Do you think the Asian feed miller has evolved to take more experiments on hand? Are they more adventurous right now, or what do you think, has the mentality changed?
Well, I think mentality changed, and the more crisis you have, the more the fastest way you will change. And I think we observe that if you look at the digitalizations after COVID, and it's a bit the same thing in the feed industry. When you have some issues in terms of access to raw materials, you have to be innovative to finding some new source of replacements. And then that's how you've been pushed to improve your formulations. Now you observe in Asia that wheat feed have been used more oftenly. You have some formulations using in shrimp or others of fish feeds without fish meal, for instance, or with really little amount of fish meal, which I think back in the days, the amount of fish meal was very important. So yes, the formulation will continue to evolve, and we will see probably more ingredients to be incorporated in your rations.
Okay, so what do you think about the ability to scale up and maintain consistency in these new ingredients? This is one of the key concerns for many feed millers when looking at novel ingredients.
Yeah, this is really a key point, right? This is true that today a lot of these novel ingredients, because of the stage where they are, the volume is small. So for feed millers, sometimes you're sort of wondering why you will bother to add them now in terms of volumes. But it is really critical to stay on your toes to incorporate all these new ingredients, because this is the future of how you will do formulation, as this is the future of the feed industry. And of course, the scale up is critical. The scale up is really critical because it's the way how you reach that critical mass to have the sustainable economics. Meaning how you reach this sort of a price parity, or being below the sort of replacements you're doing. And how much this technology will cost, basically. This is very important. This is about how much it will cost in terms of capex with these new technologies, right? When you scale up in terms of innovations. And I think the way to improve that is really continue to innovate with R&D and continue to fund those innovations. And again, in terms of formulations, and I'm not an expert anymore because I haven't touched formulation for a while, but it's not a one-for-one when you replace, because each ingredient will have a different profile in terms of amino acids and energies and so on. So you will have a dynamic way to approach it. But again, I think the functionality of these ingredients will be taken more important part of the way how you do your formulations.
That's right. Just to add to this, I mean, when you talk about the capex and the investment that is required, do you think it makes more sense for feed integrators to also invest in this on their own, or depend on outsourcing or other companies to produce these novel ingredients? Because traditionally, they, like a lot of them, also invest in the sourcing aspect and farming also. But when it comes to the novel ingredients, do you think they can maintain that same level of control in the supply chain?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think there's one single model. Each feed millers would have a different strategy, but I think it goes to the same point: is how you get sort of prime access in terms of sourcings of those novel ingredients, and how you stay again ahead of in terms of intelligence about those novel ingredients. Doesn't mean you need a commercial tied up, or even go beyond with taking some investments at the early stage with some of these players. It will depend on your strategy, but depending how you structure it in terms of financial models or participations, you definitely will gain from having a closer contact with those innovations.
Now we come to the big question of climate change. This is going to have a huge impact on agricultural output and reliability. Do you think this will push more livestock producers to look for feed proteins that are not of plant origin, especially as agricultural products will be needed more to meet requirements of human food?
Yeah, I think climate change is very important topic, and especially in our industry, giving the sort of footprint that is involved, right? And we do see already the impact of climate change, right? As I mentioned, the supply shock related to drought or flood is already impacting our business, right? So I think the way how you do sourcings and formulations is have to take into account climate change. And same way that is no more about the just-in-time approach, you have to do a just-in-case. It's really about developing the optionality, how to be more flexible, and how to promote some of these ingredients where having a more important impact in terms of solving some issues of the climate change.
So, following up with climate change also, how does sustainability play into sourcing of these novel ingredients? And can we avoid making the same mistakes we did with traditional feed proteins? Not all these novel ingredients are clean per se. So how do you work around that?
Yeah, well, the cleanness is really a relative way to consider it, right? I think what is sustainable today will probably not be tomorrow. I think the way how sustainability is conceived now it is a work in progress. This is very something dynamic that will continue to evolve. This is the first point I want to mention. But sustainability today is no more a good to have. It needs to be translated in terms of commitment from the industry to really take over across the ecosystems, including those who are financiers like ourselves. So yeah, I would not call it mistake, but it's really about where we are today in terms of sustainability, and really how we can do more than just catching up, right? I think the way how we need to approach sustainability is how we can be ahead of this existing standard today to challenge the rest of the industry to continue to evolve in the right directions. And innovations is definitely there to change the way how we approach it. And I think this is really interesting to see the last 5 years where a lot of these novel ingredients will take part of sort of pushing further this discussion around sustainability in our feed industry.
Okay, that's great. I think we could end with the note that sustainability is a work in progress, and we'll have to see how they evolve as they move forward. Thank you, JY, for this, and it was a very illuminating talk.
For feed millers out there, the message is clear. Look for diversity when it comes to new feed proteins and don't put all your eggs in one basket. Thank you for listening to us at Asian Agribiz Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcast to keep up to date on the latest happenings in the animal protein industry in Asia.